Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and frankly, deeply complex geopolitical analysis called the diminishing empire, Putin's failed quest for glory. The source material we're digging into presents this massive central irony. It lays out how a leader's relentless quest for historical greatness and imperial expansion has actually triggered the exact opposite, an unprecedented national decline. We're going to break down exactly how this happened, step by step, using the data and analysis right from the text. To really get our heads around this, let's look at a defining quote straight from the beginning of the source material. It reads, "What Putin wants more than anything else in the world is to be recognized as the man who made Russia great again." According to the analysis, understanding this specific ego-driven motivation is absolutely crucial to unpacking the whole geopolitical puzzle. The source argues that for Putin, how people treat him is literally how they treat Russia. It's this deeply personal pursuit of legacy, and as we'll see, that pursuit has completely reshaped the world map. So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the quest for glory, then move into the Ukraine paradox, fading global influence, China's quiet expansion, the domestic toll, and finally, a broken legacy. All right, Section 1, the quest for glory, the grand vision. What's super interesting here is how the source actually frames the motivation behind the invasion. It points out that Putin desperately desires a level of reverence matching the old czars and Soviet leaders. He literally wanted Ukraine to be the key to making Russia fundamentally larger and more glorious. But here's the kicker. The analysis assesses that the invasion was never truly about the fear of an actual hot war with NATO. No, it was this deep-seated fear that NATO would expand during his personal time in office. Basically, he was terrified the West would outlast him. His sphere of influence would shrink on his watch, and his historical stature would be totally ruined. Moving on to Section 2, the Ukraine paradox, backfiring ambitions. Talk about a massive gap between expectation and reality. The expectation was to subjugate Ukraine quickly, secure a mind-blowing $15 trillion in mineral wealth, and gain the raw prestige of a conqueror right on NATO's border. The reality? Well, it's a 4-year static front line where Russia has been totally exposed as a paper tiger. Meanwhile, Ukraine has somehow transformed into a drone diplomacy powerhouse. The analysis argues that the invasion effectively lit a fuse, turning a primary target into a global military heavy hitter. Seriously, look at how Ukraine has evolved based on the text. They're out there striking decade-long deals in the Middle East with places like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, all driven by their new drone tech. And despite not even being a member, Ukraine is now deeply ingratiated into NATO structures. The analysis cites a report from the Atlantic Council that's just wild. It states Ukrainian soldiers actually often outperform their NATO peers in joint exercises. They went from being seen as a security burden to literally providing the blueprint for stopping Russia in its tracks. This brings us to Section 3, fading global influence, losing the Caucasus, and beyond. The data here illustrates a really crucial point. Putin just can't leverage his military or cheap gas to control former allies anymore. Take Armenia, once a totally reliable client state. They just re-elected a pro-EU prime minister, completely ignoring Russian threats to hike their highly discounted $177.50 gas prices. Then you have Azerbaijan, who completely cut ties after a disastrous incident in December 2024 where a civilian plane was shot down, killing 38 people, which was then compounded by Russian police torturing its citizens. Moldova is sprinting toward the EU, and Tajikistan literally watched its Russian protection forces pack up their weapons and head off to the Ukrainian front lines. Russia's regional influence is just vanishing. And this failure to project power isn't just local, it extends globally. Leaders in Syria, Venezuela, and Iran were all promised Russian protection. Yet since the war started, leaders in those nations have been killed or deposed, and Russia didn't or just couldn't intervene. The analysis notes this sends a loud and clear message worldwide. Russia is currently completely incapable of protecting its geopolitical partners. Let's shift gears to Section 4, China's quiet expansion, the power imbalance. To really put the geography into perspective here, the Far Eastern Federal District accounts for a massive 40% of all Russian territory. But what is absolutely staggering, as the source points out, is that this giant expanse is home to just 8 million people. And of course, it sits right next door to China, a nation that's been watching these changing power dynamics very closely. Interestingly, China is playing the long game and cleverly leveraging Putin's distraction. They aren't invading, they're just quietly taking economic control without firing a single shot. When European firms pulled out, Chinese firms swooped right in to replace them. They've set up these special administrative regions in Siberia where, get this, the Chinese yuan has completely replaced the Russian ruble for everyday business. Now, this creates a deeply fatal dependency. China currently buys roughly 50% of Russia's crude oil. That's half. If Beijing suddenly decides to pull back on those purchases, Putin's entire war machine, and really the country's economic stability, just crumbles to dust. He essentially has no choice but to look the other way as Chinese influence quietly swallows up his Far East territory. Which leads perfectly into Section 5, the domestic toll, paying for the war. $142 million. The source drops this staggering number, explaining that it represents the planned cuts to just the 2026 federal road maintenance budget. Because every single penny is being pinched for the war effort, this cut effectively evaporates 2,000 kilometers of highway modernization. And then you have this number, 105,000. That is the number of public sector workers Moscow plans to cut in 2026, and that's on top of tens of thousands of cuts the year prior. The text points out a really grim reality here. Out of sheer desperation, many of these laid-off workers may very well end up drafted right onto the front lines. The sheer scale of this domestic economic collapse is honestly hard to wrap your head around. Right now, 81% of Russians are actively cutting back on their food budgets just to survive. An unbelievable 200,000 small and medium-sized businesses went completely bankrupt in just the first 3 months of 2026. On top of that, the government is ending co-financing for pensions, and when you combine that with ongoing fuel crises and major shortages of imported goods, the everyday standard of living is being absolutely crippled. When you look at the economic data, the contrast is stark. The official inflation rate in Russia is stated as 5.3%. The base interest rate is already quite high at 14.25%. But the source cites Swedish intelligence claiming that Russia is actively faking its data. They estimate the actual inflation is closer to 15%. This massive gap proves that everyday citizens just can't afford basic goods anymore, nor can they afford the interest payments on the loans that might have kept them afloat in the past.
Finally, Section 6, a broken legacy, the final gamble.
Based on all of this, the analysis suggests Putin is left with a highly desperate three-step gamble. Step 1. Somehow capture the Donbass region by the end of the year, even though they're crashing against the highly fortified fortress belt. Step 2. Spin that to claim a partial victory to the Russian public. And Step 3. Attempt to negotiate from a perceived position of power. But here's the thing. The source heavily implies this gamble is bound to fail, since Ukraine is fully prepared to defend the Donbass well into 2027 and beyond. And making matters even worse for his legacy, even his past glories are being systematically dismantled. Take occupied Crimea. Seized back in 2014, it was long considered his prized conquest. But today, it's being actively isolated by a brilliant systematic Ukrainian campaign. It's literally being transformed from a crown jewel into a towering symbol of Russian failure. So that leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question posed by the material. Will Putin's final gamble somehow secure his legacy, or has the dream of a greater Russia already completely vanished? The source's conclusion is quite definitive. It asserts that instead of being remembered as the man who made Russia great, he's going to be written into history as the leader who bankrupted his nation and drove it into global irrelevance. It's a sobering analysis of how ego and miscalculation can permanently alter the course of history. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this deep dive helped bring such a complex topic into sharp focus for you. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.